June 4, 1942. 0430 hours. 240 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, Central Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukita, air commander aboard the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi, watches from the bridge as 108 aircraft launch into the pre-dawn darkness, 36 Kate torpedo bombers, 36 Val dive bombers, 36 Zero fighters. Their target, the American airbase on Midway Island. Fukita, the same man who led the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier, is confident. Behind Akagi's team, 3 more fleet carriers, Kaga, Sario, and Hiria, the most powerful striking force in naval history. 400 miles to the east, American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown wait in ambush, their positions unknown to the Japanese. Admiral Chester Nimitz has broken Japanese naval codes. He knows the attack is coming. He's positioned his carriers to strike when the Japanese are most vulnerable. Fukita doesn't know it yet, but in 6 hours, all 4 Japanese carriers will be burning wrecks. The strike force preparing to devastate Midway will never return to their ships. And the course of the Pacific War will reverse in a single morning. This is the story of those 6 hours, June 4, 1942. 0430 to 1030 hours, when Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 men. More importantly, Japan lost the strategic initiative it had held since Pearl Harbor. The Empire's advance would stop at Midway. After this day, Japan would fight a losing defensive war until final defeat 3 years later. To understand why Midway mattered, you need to understand what happened in the 6 months before. December 7, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, devastating the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleship force. In the following months, Japan conquers a vast empire: Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Dutch East Indies, Burma, dozens of Pacific islands. By May 1942, Japan controls territory from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutians to the approaches to Australia. It's the most rapid military expansion in modern history. But Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, knows this success is temporary. Japan's industrial capacity is 1/10 of America's. Given time, American production will overwhelm Japan. Yamamoto needs to force a decisive battle that destroys America's remaining carrier force, specifically the carriers that escaped Pearl Harbor, Enterprise, Lexington, Yorktown, and Hornet. If he can sink these carriers, America will need years to rebuild. Japan can consolidate its conquests, establish defensive perimeters, and perhaps negotiate favorable peace. Yamamoto selects Midway Atoll, a tiny American base 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, as his target. Midway is strategically valuable. If captured, it extends Japan's defensive perimeter and threatens Hawaii. More importantly, Yamamoto believes the Americans must defend Midway. When Japanese carriers attack Midway, the U.S. carriers will respond. The resulting battle will decide the Pacific War. Yamamoto's plan is complex: attack the Aleutian Islands as diversion, send a massive invasion force to capture Midway, use 4 fleet carriers to destroy the defending aircraft and support the invasion, and when U.S. carriers arrive to defend Midway, destroy them with overwhelming force. It's a good plan. But it has a fatal flaw: Yamamoto assumes the Americans don't know it's coming. But the Americans do know. Commander Joseph Rockefort, head of the U.S. Navy's Cryptanalysis Unit at Pearl Harbor, has partially broken Japanese naval codes. Throughout May 1942, Rockeford's team intercepts Japanese radio traffic indicating a major operation planned for early June against target AF. Rockeford believes AF is Midway, but needs confirmation. He devises a clever test. He has Midway send an uncoded radio message reporting their water distillation plant has broken down. 2 days later, Japanese radio intercepts report AF is short of fresh water. The confirmation is complete. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, now knows the Japanese plan. He knows when early June. He knows where Midway. He knows how many carriers, 4 fleet carriers plus lighter units. Most importantly, he knows Yamamoto doesn't know the Americans know. Nimitz positions his carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown northeast of Midway, outside Japanese search patterns, waiting in ambush. The Japanese search plans assume American carriers will approach from Hawaii to the east. Instead, they're already on station to the north, positioned to strike the Japanese carriers while they're attacking Midway. It's the greatest intelligence coup of the Pacific War. Yamamoto is sailing into a trap. On June 3, American patrol aircraft spot the Japanese invasion force 700 miles west of Midway. The battle is beginning. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, receives his orders from Nimitz. You will be governed by the principle of calculated risk, which you shall interpret to mean the avoidance of exposure of your force to attack by superior enemy forces without good prospect of inflicting greater damage to the enemy. June 4, 04:30 hours. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commanding the carrier striking force from Akagi, launches the first Midway strike 108 aircraft. Nagumo is cautious. He's keeping back a reserve strike force of 93 aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships in case American carriers appear. This reserve is his ace. If U.S. carriers show up, he can launch them immediately for a devastating attack. At 0534 hours, a Japanese scout plane reports sighting American ships, but doesn't specify carriers. Nagumo wants clarification. While he waits, events accelerate. At 0545, the first Midway strike force reports heavy resistance. They need another attack wave to suppress the island's defenses. Nagumo faces a decision: keep his reserve aircraft armed for attacking ships in case American carriers appear, or rearm them with land attack bombs to finish off Midway? At 0715, still without confirmation of American carriers, Nagumo orders the reserve aircraft rearmed for land attack. It's a logical decision based on available information. But it's about to become catastrophic. Down in the carrier's hangars, ordnance crews begin the laborious process of switching weapons, remove torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, replace with land attack bombs and incendiaries. The removed ordnance is stacked on hangar decks, no time to return it to magazines. The process takes at least an hour. While Japanese carriers steam toward Midway with their decks full of aircraft being rearmed, American carrier aircraft are already in the air, searching for them. At 0728, the Japanese scout that earlier reported American ships finally sends clarification: enemy force includes what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo is stunned. American carriers are here, already, positioned to strike. He immediately orders: stop the rearming, put the torpedoes back on, prepare to launch anti-ship strike. But it's too late. The rearming process must be reversed. Torpedoes must go back on aircraft that now have land attack bombs. It will take at least another hour. While Japanese carriers scramble to reverse the rearming, American strike aircraft are launching from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The American plan is to hit the Japanese carriers while they're recovering aircraft from the Midway strike, the moment of maximum vulnerability when flight decks are crowded with landing aircraft, fuel lines are open, and ammunition is exposed. But the American attack is poorly coordinated. The three carriers launch strikes separately. Aircraft from different carriers take different routes. The formations lose cohesion. Some squadrons can't find the Japanese fleet. It's nearly a disaster. At 0820, Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8-15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron finds the Japanese carriers. Waldron attacks immediately without fighter escort or dive bomber support. It's suicidal. Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire devastate the slow, obsolete Devastators. All 15 aircraft are shot down. Ensign George Gay, the only survivor, watches from the water as his squadron is annihilated in minutes. More American torpedo squadrons arrive and attack, Torpedo 6 from Enterprise, Torpedo 3 from Yorktown. They attack without coordination, without fighter support, against overwhelming Japanese defenses. The results are catastrophic. Of 41 American torpedo bombers attacking that morning, 35 are shot down. Not a single torpedo hits. Japanese fighter pilots are exultant. They're destroying American attacks with minimal effort. Admiral Nagumo breathes easier. If this is the best the Americans can do, the battle is winnable. He just needs time to finish rearming his strike force and launch. But the torpedo attacks, though they fail completely, have one critical effect. They draw Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, chasing torpedo bombers. The sky above the Japanese carriers is nearly empty of defending fighters. And at that exact moment, American dive bombers arrive at 19,000 feet. 0922 hours. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber squadron, rolls his SBD Dauntless into a 70-degree dive from 19,000 feet. Behind him, 30 more dive bombers follow, 17 from Enterprise, 17 from Yorktown, which arrived simultaneously by coincidence. Below them, the Japanese carriers Kaga, Akagi, and Sorya steam in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed. The rearming is nearly complete. In minutes, a massive strike force will launch against the American carriers. But in the next 6 minutes, everything changes. McCluskey's bombers plunge toward Kaga, the largest carrier. At 2,500 feet, they release. The first bomb misses. The second hits near the island, exploding among parked aircraft. The third and fourth bombs penetrate the flight deck and explode in the hangar, where the rearmed aircraft and stacked ordnance wait. Kaga erupts in flames. Simultaneously, Yorktown's bombers hit Soryu. 3 bombs penetrate her flight deck within minutes. Massive explosions tear through the hangar as fuel and ordnance detonate. Soryu is transformed into a blazing wreck. At 0926, 4 minutes after the attack began, another group of dive bombers from Enterprise hits Akagi, the flagship. 1 bomb smashes through the flight deck amid the massed aircraft. It explodes in the hangar among the torpedoes and bombs removed during the rearming but never returned to magazines. Secondary explosions rip through the ship. Admiral Nagumo, on Akagi's bridge, watches his flagship dissolve into flames. The carrier that led the Pearl Harbor attack is dying. In 6 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers have been reduced to burning hulks. The aircraft that were being armed to destroy the American carriers are now flaming wreckage. The bombs and torpedoes stacked on hangar decks during the hurried rearming are causing massive secondary explosions. The decision made at 0715 to rearm for land attack has become catastrophic. Aboard the burning carriers, damage control parties fight desperately to save their ships. But it's hopeless. The fires have spread too far, the secondary explosions too intense. Kaga burns out of control. At 1,640 hours, racked by explosions, she sinks. 811 men perish with her. Soria's situation is even worse. The 3 bomb hits have utterly destroyed her. At 1910 hours, she slips beneath the waves. 718 men are lost. Akagi, the proud flagship, burns throughout the afternoon. Admiral Nagumo transfers to a cruiser and watches his flagship die. At 0500 the next morning, June 5, Japanese destroyers torpedo Akagi to prevent capture. 267 men perish. Of the 4 fleet carriers that launched the Midway attack, only Hiryu remains operational. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Hiryu, refuses to retreat. His carrier launches 2 strikes against the American carriers, finding and damaging Yorktown severely. But it's too late. At 1,700 hours, American dive bombers from Enterprise find Hiryu. They hit her with 4 bombs in minutes. Like her sister carriers, Hiryu erupts in flames. Admiral Yamaguchi chooses to go down with his ship, refusing rescue. At 0230 on June 5, Hiryu sinks. 392 men are lost. In less than 24 hours, Japan has lost 4 fleet carriers, the core of its naval power. The American victory isn't without cost. Yorktown, damaged by Hiryu's attack, will sink on June 7 after being torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. 141 American sailors perish with her. But the strategic outcome is decisive. Japan has lost 4 fleet carriers it cannot quickly replace. America, with its massive industrial capacity, will build more than 20 fleet and light carriers by 1945. The balance of naval power in the Pacific has shifted irreversibly. The pilots who struck the decisive blows remember the moment. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding Enterprise's Bombing Squadron 3, led the dive that hit Akagi. He later wrote, "I rolled into my dive at 0926 hours. Below me, I could see 3 carriers in formation, their decks covered with aircraft. I'd never seen a more perfect target. I centered my sight on the carrier with the red rising sun painted on the flight deck. That was Akagi. At 2,500 feet, I released. I pulled out hard and looked back. My bomb had penetrated the flight deck just behind the island. Even as I watched, a massive explosion tore through the deck. Secondary explosions followed. The entire carrier seemed to erupt. I knew immediately she was finished. In that moment, I understood we'd won the battle. A carrier force without carriers can't fight. I felt no exultation, just cold professional satisfaction. We'd done our job. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading Yorktown's dive bombers, struck Soryu. His report states, "We arrived over the Japanese carriers at 0922 hours and immediately pushed over into attack dives. I selected the northernmost carrier, later identified as Soryu. My bomb struck forward of the island. Before my squadron completed its attack, at least 2 more bombs hit. The carrier was smothered in flames within seconds. Watching from altitude after pulling out, I saw the entire flight deck become a sheet of fire. Aircraft exploded. The carrier was clearly doomed. The speed with which she was destroyed was remarkable and terrifying. It showed how vulnerable carriers are when caught with armed aircraft on deck. Wade McCluskey, who found the Japanese fleet and led the Enterprise attack, later testified, "The success at Midway came from timing and fortune. If we'd arrived 5 minutes earlier, the Japanese would still have been recovering their Midway strike. We might not have caught so many aircraft on deck. 5 minutes later, they might have launched. We arrived at the perfect moment." And the torpedo attacks, though they failed tactically, drew the Japanese fighters down, leaving our dive bombers unopposed. Fortune favored us that day. Japanese survivors remember confusion and horror. Petty Officer Yuji Akamatsu, flight deck crew aboard Kaga, later testified, "We were preparing aircraft for launch, fueling, arming, final checks. The morning Midway strike was due back soon. We'd need to land them, refuel them, and launch them again." There was a second strike being prepared in the hangar. Everything was rushed. Then air raid alarms sounded. I looked up and saw American dive bombers coming straight down, nothing between them and us. Our fighters were all at low altitude, chasing American torpedo planes. I started running, but there was nowhere to go. The first bomb hit among the aircraft on the forward deck. The explosion threw me across the deck. I got up and everything was fire. Aircraft burning, fuel lines rupturing, men screaming. A second bomb hit. Then a third. In less than 2 minutes, the entire flight deck was an inferno. I made it to the side and jumped into the ocean. I swam away and watched Kaga burn. The fires were so intense that ammunition and bombs started cooking off. The ship shuddered with explosions. I was in the water for 3 hours before a destroyer picked me up. When I looked back, Kaga was gone. I'd served on her for 2 years. In 10 minutes, she went from powerful warship to burning wreck. Lieutenant Joichi Tamanaga, one of the few Japanese pilots to return from the Midway strike, landed on Hiryu, the only carrier still operational, and volunteered to lead the strike against the American carriers. His aircraft had been damaged, fuel tank hold, leaking fuel. Mechanics said it would take an hour to repair. Tomonaga replied, "We don't have an hour. The American carriers must be struck now or we lose the battle." He led the strike against Yorktown with a leaking fuel tank, knowing he couldn't return. Tomonaga's strike damaged Yorktown, but he was shot down and perished. He was 34 years old. The strategic implications become clear immediately. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding from the battleship Yamato hundreds of miles away, receives reports of the carrier losses throughout the morning. By afternoon, he knows the battle is lost. Without carrier air cover, his invasion force can't approach Midway. American land-based aircraft would destroy it. Without carriers, his battleships are vulnerable to American carrier strikes. The entire operation has failed. At 1,500 hours, Yamamoto orders general retirement. The invasion of Midway is cancelled. The fleet retreats toward Japan. But the implications extend far beyond Midway. Japan has lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day. These ships took years to build, their airgroups years to train. The 248 aircraft lost and, more importantly, the experienced pilots and aircrew represent a quarter of Japan's carrier aviation capability. Some losses are replaceable. Ships can be built, aircraft manufactured. But the pilots lost at Midway, including veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Indian Ocean, are irreplaceable. Japanese pilot training programs, designed for short war against weaker opponents, can't produce replacements with equivalent skill and experience. From Midway forward, the quality of Japanese naval aviation will steadily decline. The Americans, by contrast, have massive training programs producing thousands of pilots annually. The Battle of Midway marks the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan's offensive capability is broken. The Empire will fight defensively for 3 more years, but it will never regain the initiative. Every subsequent battle, Guadalcanal, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, will be fought with Japan trying to hold territory rather than expand. The 6 hours on June 4, 1942, determined the war's outcome. Admiral Nimitz later wrote, "Midway was essentially a victory of intelligence. We knew the Japanese plan, positioned our forces accordingly, and struck at the decisive moment. But execution mattered too. Our pilots showed extraordinary courage attacking against overwhelming odds. 35 torpedo bombers sacrificed themselves, drawing Japanese fighters down, allowing our dive bombers to strike unopposed. They deserve equal credit for the victory." Modern analysis confirms Midway's decisive nature, but historians debate what would have happened if Japan had won. If Nagumo's carriers had destroyed the American carriers at Midway, Japan would have achieved naval superiority in the Pacific for perhaps a year. But would this have changed the war's ultimate outcome? Probably not. America's industrial capacity was simply too overwhelming. In 1942, the United States produced 47,000 aircraft. Japan produced 8,900. In 1943, the gap widened. America produced 86,000 aircraft, Japan 16,700. The American economy, fully mobilized, operated at a scale Japan couldn't match. Even a Midway victory couldn't overcome this fundamental imbalance. But Midway as it actually happened accelerated Japan's defeat significantly. The carrier losses forced Japan onto the defensive immediately, rather than after extended operations that would have caused far higher American casualties. The battle's tactical details reveal how close the outcome was to being reversed. If Nagumo had launched his reserve strike immediately when American ships were first reported at 0534, Japanese aircraft might have found and struck the American carriers before the American dive bombers arrived. If the scout plane had specified carrier in its initial report rather than waiting 45 minutes to clarify, Nagumo wouldn't have ordered the fatal rearming. If American torpedo squadrons had coordinated their attacks with dive bombers instead of attacking piecemeal, Japanese fighters might not have been drawn down to sea level, and dive bombers would have faced opposition. If McCluskey had turned back just minutes earlier in his search, he wouldn't have found the Japanese fleet. The battle pivoted on minutes and coincidences. But wars are won by the side that exploits such moments. American intelligence created the opportunity. American pilots executed with skill and courage. Japanese decisions, especially the rearming order, created vulnerability at the critical moment. The result was the most decisive naval battle in Pacific history. The human cost of those 6 hours was severe on both sides. Japan lost 3,057 men, 811 aboard Kaga, 718 aboard Soryu, 267 aboard Akagi, 392 aboard Hiryu. These numbers don't include the pilots and aircrew shot down during operations, perhaps another 100 men. Many of these casualties occurred not during the American attacks, but afterward, when burning carriers exploded or sank with men still trapped aboard. American casualties at Midway numbered 307, 141 aboard Yorktown when she sank, 166 aircrew shot down during attacks on Japanese forces. The torpedo squadron losses were particularly severe. Torpedo 8, from Hornet, lost all 15 aircraft and 29 of 30 crew, only Ensign Gay survived. Torpedo 6 lost 10 of 14 aircraft. Torpedo 3 lost 10 of 12 aircraft. Of 41 torpedo bombers attacking Japanese carriers, only 6 returned. The dive bomber squadrons, though more successful, also suffered. 18 dive bombers were shot down or lost. These men flew obsolete aircraft against the world's most experienced carrier force and most capable fighter pilots. They attacked without adequate fighter escort, often without coordination. Many knew their chances of survival were poor. They attacked anyway. Ensign George Gay, sole survivor of Torpedo 8, later wrote, "We knew we were attacking without fighter cover. We knew the Zeros would be waiting. Commander Waldron told us before we launched, if there's only one plane left to make the attack, I want that man to go in and get a hit." Every pilot in the squadron understood, we were probably not coming back. But those Japanese carriers had to be stopped. If we didn't attack, they'd destroy our carriers. So we attacked. I watched every plane in my squadron get shot down. I ended up in the water watching the battle continue overhead. I felt no regret about the attack, only grief for my lost squadron mates. They died doing their duty. That has to mean something. In Japan, news of Midway is suppressed. The public is told of a great victory with American carriers sunk. The loss of 4 Japanese carriers is not announced. Even within the military, information is restricted. Surviving officers and crew are quarantined and told not to discuss the battle. The truth slowly emerges over months. When the extent of the disaster becomes known, it's blamed on bad luck and American numerical superiority, not on the strategic and tactical decisions that actually caused the defeat. Admiral Nagumo is not held accountable. He continues in command of carrier forces, presiding over additional defeats at Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. His defensive mentality and cautious nature, the traits that led to the fatal rearming decision at Midway, continue to harm Japanese operations. He dies by suicide on Saipan in July 1944 as American forces overrun the island. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Midway operation, lives with the defeat for barely a year. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercept his inspection itinerary. U.S. Army Air Force P-38 fighters ambush his transport over Bougainville. Yamamoto is fatally wounded in the attack. He was 59. His death is a severe blow to Japanese naval morale. In America, Midway is celebrated as decisive victory, correctly so. The Pacific Fleet's carriers, especially Enterprise, become symbols of American resurgence. Enterprise participates in nearly every major Pacific battle for the next 3 years, earning 20 battle stars. She survives the war and is decommissioned in 1947. She should have been preserved as a museum, but was scrapped in 1958, a loss to history. The pilots who won at Midway receive recognition, though many don't survive the war. Wade McCluskey survives and retires as Rear Admiral in 1956. Richard Best is forced to retire in 1944 due to tuberculosis contracted from faulty oxygen equipment during the Midway dive. His bombs hit Academy, but the mission cost him his health. He dies in 2001 at age 91. The Battle of Midway offers enduring lessons for military strategy and decision-making. First, intelligence wins battles. American code-breaking created the conditions for victory by revealing Japanese plans and enabling perfect positioning. Without this intelligence advantage, American carriers might have blundered into Japanese trap rather than creating their own. Intelligence, properly used, is a force multiplier greater than any weapon. Second, carrier warfare is unforgiving of mistakes. The 6 hours between 04:30 and 10:30 on June 4 show how quickly dominance can reverse. At dawn, Japan held overwhelming advantage. 6 hours later, Japan's carrier force was destroyed. The critical rearming decision at 0715, logical at the time, became fatal when American carriers appeared unexpectedly. In carrier warfare, there's no margin for error. Third, tactics matter as much as technology. American torpedo bombers were obsolete, slow, poorly armed, easy prey for Zeros. Their attacks failed completely. Yet their sacrifice drew Japanese fighters to sea level, enabling dive bombers to attack unopposed. Unintentionally, the failed torpedo attacks created conditions for dive bomber success. Courage and timing can overcome technological disadvantage. Fourth, training and doctrine determine outcomes as much as numbers. Japanese pilot quality in 1942 was exceptional. Pearl Harbor veterans with years of experience. But Japan's training system couldn't replace losses. America's massive training programs produced thousands of pilots. Individual Japanese pilots in 1942 were probably better than individual American pilots. But American pilots improved throughout the war while Japanese quality declined from irreplaceable losses. Fifth, industrial capacity decides long wars. Japan could not match American production. Even had Japan won at Midway, the outcome would only have been delayed. America would have built more carriers, trained more pilots, and returned with overwhelming force. Industrial wars are won in factories as much as battlefields. The 6 hours that changed the Pacific War demonstrate how history pivots on moments, decisions made under pressure with incomplete information, courage displayed against overwhelming odds, fortune favoring one side over another. At 0430 on June 4, Japan dominated the Pacific. By 10:30, Japan was on the defensive for the remainder of the war. The individuals who made decisions that morning, Nagumo ordering the rearming, McCluskey deciding to continue his search, Waldron attacking without support, Best selecting Akagi as his target, shaped history. Small decisions, made under stress, cascaded into strategic consequences. We should remember Midway not just as American victory but as human story, men on both sides doing their duty as they understood it, some making brilliant decisions, others fatal errors, many showing extraordinary courage regardless of outcome. The Japanese pilots who flew from burning carriers to strike Yorktown, knowing they couldn't return, showed courage equal to the American torpedo crews who attacked against hopeless odds. War reveals human nature, courage, sacrifice, error, fear, without regard to nationality. The lessons of Midway remain relevant. Intelligence matters. Preparation matters. Fortune matters. Courage matters. Small decisions have large consequences. Technology alone doesn't win battles, how it's used matters more. And ultimately, industrial capacity and sustainable training systems matter more than tactical genius. We preserve these stories not to glorify war but to learn from it. The 3,364 men who died at Midway, Japanese and American, deserve remembrance as individuals who served their countries and paid war's ultimate price. They were not statistics but people, sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. Their sacrifice, on both sides, should make us more reluctant to resort to war except when absolutely necessary. The strategic outcome of Midway was decisive. Japan lost the Pacific War in those 6 hours. But the human cost was real for families on both sides. May we remember both the military significance and the human tragedy. The Battle of Midway remains the most studied naval engagement of World War II. Historians continue debating details. What if Nagumo had acted differently? What if American attacks had been better coordinated? What if fortune had favored Japan instead? These counterfactuals are intellectually interesting but ultimately speculative. What's certain is what actually happened. In 6 hours on June 4, 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, America lost 1, and the balance of Pacific naval power shifted irreversibly. The men who fought that day, pilots diving through anti-aircraft fire, sailors fighting fires on burning carriers, commanders making split-second decisions, determined outcomes far beyond their individual fates. Their actions that morning echoed through 3 more years of war and shaped the post-war Pacific. We preserve their stories because history is not just dates and statistics, it's human decisions, courage, error, sacrifice. The dive bomber pilot centering his sight on an enemy carrier. The torpedo crew pressing their attack against impossible odds. The Japanese sailor abandoning his burning ship. The admiral receiving news that changes war's direction. These individual moments, aggregated, become history. Midway teaches us that battles are not inevitable outcomes but contingent events influenced by intelligence, preparation, decision-making, courage, and fortune. 6 hours changed the course of history because men made decisions and took actions that mattered. May we remember their story with accuracy, respect their courage regardless of which side they served, learn from their experiences, and honor their sacrifice by studying this history carefully, understanding how wars develop, how battles are won and lost, and why peace is worth preserving. The 6 hours at Midway show war's decisive moments and human cost. Let us remember both.